Hello and welcome one and all to episode 3 of the podcast. We're still in the pre-existence phase. I'm Will Chernoff and I'm joined by Carson. How are you doing, my man?
I'm doing very well. I'm happy to be here talking with you. How are you?
I'm good. You know, the music recommendation thing that's running through our first 3 episodes, I'm still enjoying that. I'm still taking pride in that because it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, man, if I can't toss off at least one music recommendation to my best friends per week, like, what am I even doing here? You know what I'm saying?
I love that. Yeah, you've hit me with a couple over the last few weeks, and they've been great. I'll have to start returning the favor. I've been mostly just listening to what you've been sending me.
That's what I like to hear. I mean, you said that you wanted to toss in a recommendation section that a lot of podcasts have, and they often play dinky little theme music before they hit it at the end. I don't think we're going to do that this time. We might get there, but we'll see if we can remember to do that at the end after our big piece of meat topic that we have lined up for today, where we can recommend a cultural thing when we get there. But this is a great episode idea that we've put on the docket for the pre-existence era of the show, because it's where we get to swap tales from our backgrounds. There's some things that I feel like I don't even know as well as I could, even though I've known you for like close to 15 years pretty soon. There's a lot there about how we ended up on the working paths that we're on, which are both different, but we also made a lot of the same stops along the way before going in different directions. We both have albums as a leader or co-leaders, and so those have their own kind of weird stories of how they got made. We've both continued to play through it all, no matter what we've done for work, and so we have different notions of career when it comes to playing music, or what we view in general when we look out at the arts world. So that's the big bucket of stuff that we lined up to talk about today. If you don't have a particular place where you wanted to start an inquiry, I do, but I am happy to defer to you. What do you think?
I'm wide open, so why don't you take it away?
So I really realized that this is a personalized thing that you don't get a view of unless you get the right personal situation to ask somebody. And here we're putting it out in the open, but I think this is a funny way to look at it. And it's a question that you wouldn't ask as small talk or anything, but you'd have to know somebody a little bit. But I think for everybody like us, there was some point where the idea of the musical or artistic career was first introduced to us, foisted upon us, appealed to us, whatever that initial exposure ended up feeling like. I think there's a range of what it could have felt like, good or bad. And I know what mine was, but I guess it hit me when I was thinking about this topic that you don't really know what anybody else's is unless you specifically get to ask them. So I would ask you that. When was the first time that you were exposed to the possibility that you could have a musical or artistic career?
I remember the day. I believe it was January 12th, 2009. So I would have been in ninth grade, and I done. I remember the day because it was kind of a good day for a lot of reasons. I had gotten. This is so embarrassing to admit on a podcast. I also was like a theater kid at one point in high school, or was in plays in high school. I don't know if I even own the title of theater kid.
Tell what type of community you were in. You were not in a big city. Where were you?
I grew up in Smithers, BC, so a town of like 5,000 people. Pretty small community, pretty artsy community, which is kind of how this got started. So on that Monday of January 12th, 2009, I got my very first like casting in the school Shakespeare play. And I don't really remember what the role was, but it was one I was excited about. And that same day, I got asked to do my first paid drumming gig. And the theater thing, I was not interested in that as a career, but the music thing, when my drum teacher asked me if I would it was a subbing gig, basically. My drum teacher happened to drum for the community choir in Smithers and was in the community choir, and they had a performance. And so he wanted to sing and not drum, and asked if I would accept some money to drum in that group. And he told me he was in the group, and I couldn't believe he was offering, or the community choir was offering to pay an honorarium to me. I thought I would have to pay money to play in it. And that felt like I was on top of the world that day. And that was the day I was like, I'm interested in trying for this as a career. That was the day I certainly knew I wanted to go study music post-secondary.
What did you want to do before that, do you think?
I think I probably hadn't given it much thought, or at least nothing had ignited that like level of passion for me. I was, a pretty like nerdy and academic kid. I thought I was interested in like creative writing. I had thought about like learning about like English literature. For a very short amount of time, when I was too young to really know anything about what this meant, I was interested in linguistics. I always thought languages were really interesting. And so that was a thing. So I guess it was always kind of like an academic kind of bent, but music was the thing that I really loved doing in my free time. And that was the first day that I really figured out that someone might like one day want to pay you money to play music.
Yeah. The reason why I asked about before was because, so this was your first vocational calling. It's not like you ended up with something else that was like firmly ensconced as something you thought you were going to do, and then you had to make a hard pivot. No, this was the first time you were able to get to such an identity.
I think so. Yeah. I think it was the first time where something I was already doing, I could see at the time, I thought I could see that being a career.
Yeah. Do you know mine?
I do not know yours. I was about to just ask. What is it?
Yeah. Cause I don't think I have had a down the middle, like pitch teeing me up to say it on any of the hits that I've done or as a host or anything before. So, it definitely wasn't before high school. Like you, it was my first feeling of a vocational calling. I didn't have a firm one beforehand, but I was not a musical kid.
Yeah.
I didn't display any musical aptitude. I didn't do anything musically unusual. I just listened to stuff on the radio, and my elementary school did start a band program for a little bit, but I just messed around and I played alto saxophone and trumpet. Nothing that led directly.
I didn't know you
to
played
what
alto.
Yeah, my first instrument was alto saxophone.
Wild. Okay. Hard pivot to bass.
Never to be picked up again, really. I mean, I didn't even own one by the time I got to high school. Then I got to high school, and it even took a year then. Like, yeah, I got into playing pre-getting the vocational tap on the shoulder. Still got into playing pretty seriously, relied on it to make my first friends. That is something I talked about, where I went to a very small elementary that was made for people with specific educational needs. I'm very grateful for that. And then I go into a public high school, and it's enormous, and I need somewhere to hide, and so I hide in the band program. And I do that for a year, and I'm having fun, and I'm playing. But the first time I got tapped for it was also an opportunity that came my way, not a paid one yet, but it's so cool how many people I already had to look up to at this time. That's just the sense that I have also been able to talk about, was just how strong of an environment that was, and how many people were ahead of me in New Westminster that I could look up to in the high school. And so in what is now the Surrey Schools Jazz Festival, where high school bands from around the province of British Columbia come and do like adjudicated performances of their best repertoire for a panel of teachers and professional musicians. This still happens. That festival, it was named something else due to a sponsor at the time, but it was in 2010. It was about a year after you had your experience. I don't know if I remember the exact day. It's sometime in like early February 2010. There was already a small ensemble at my high school that was designated to go and play. So it's not just like your high school big band that goes and plays at the jazz festival here. the school can send small ensembles of their
Yep.
most keen players.
Yep.
And sometimes if you don't have a good on the timetable band program, that's like the only thing your school can
Yeah.
send, except for maybe like one jazz band that combines all years. But I had enormous high school, so we had like a jazz band for every year. Anyways, that's a whole other thing. But there was a combo of young, 15-ish year old players.
Yeah.
And I was not in it. I was not tapped to be in this because there was another bass player who was ahead of me
Sure, yeah.
developmentally who was in it. And in this combo were people like Madeline Elkins, my
Right.
oldest and best friend in music, and Nebu Johannes, who
Yeah.
is also one of my oldest and best friends in music, and some other people. And they were set to play. And then this bass player got sick.
Wow.
And
It's always
so
a, it's
I
always
was
a
the next person up. And, little did I know that 15 years later, I'm still playing
Yeah.
with some of those people. So it's very clear that one random opportunity for me to just be the next man up, even though that wasn't a paid gig yet.
Yeah.
My first real paid gig was like sometime over a year later, and it wasn't particularly memorable, but that was
Yeah.
when I got to just step into a spot in this structure. And then I started to see the jazz scene in terms of there were like older professional people who I
Yeah.
started to see and notice, and I could follow around. And one thing led to another, and I started playing myself, and I started following these people around. And then I got to see that this is a professional space that, if
Yeah.
I just kept doing what I was doing, I could enter it.
Absolutely. I like that you mentioned getting exposed to people who were doing it professionally kind of like in short order after that. Because I think that's really what did it for me. It was, getting the offer, hey, do you want to sub in for this gig? Because I probably had done smaller, piano recitals, and I'd been playing instruments for a while, and maybe even some smaller, band stuff. But this was the first time where the band were mostly adults. I think there was one kind of other high schooler, but he was probably in 12th grade when I was in grade 9, and I considered him a pro already. And, my piano teacher was the pianist in the band. This is just small town stuff. And, these were adults who were like going out on a Tuesday night to like rehearse for a paid opportunity. And this is like something they did with their life. And that was what kind of clicked for me. It was like, this doesn't have to end when my high school band program ends, when I graduate or whatever. You can take this further and make a life out of this.
Yeah, I would even say that in a smaller community, that can happen with any vocation. Like it is more immediate that you will get to talk to the people who are doing it than if you're in a bigger city. You'll get put into the situations with people who are a generation up from you more often and more readily, and they'll kind of expect it a little bit more. So that seems to be a good thing about coming up in a smaller place, no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, I think Smithers probably skewed my perception of like how common it is to just like be a professional artist in the world. I think many people in Smithers are artists and make their living making art. And probably percentage wise of the population, not a representative sample. So I think I probably even grew up with this inflated idea that like, oh yeah, like 25% of the people in the world are just, like making a living, like teaching music or playing gigs or making visual art or something. It's not really the case broadly, but it was a really nice, community to grow up in and to get that idea and be exposed to that as a career path.
Yeah, and you mentioned in our previous pre-existence episodes here that your father is a professional visual artist, and my mother is a professional designer in industry and a longtime visual artist as well, though it has never been her main professional pursuit. She has always had an artistic core to all of her work and life, and so we both grew up with at least one very involved and strong artistic parent, so that is absolutely part of it for both of us too.
Absolutely. Yeah, major credit to that.
Yeah, because I remember my mom introducing me to every art form, like whether I would like just mess around on a canvas with her when I was a little kid, or whether she would like pick up her acoustic guitar and like we would sing Beatles songs or something. Like that was there, even though I wasn't a particularly musical kid. Those were still important along the way. And you would have had your own versions like that of what your dad was up to and how you got to see it.
Yeah, exactly. I was exposed to that. And just, as I became, later in my teens, working with other professional musicians and artists, and many people in Miss Smithers were kind of multidisciplinary. And so you got to see kind of life through how they kind of make their artistic life work and see a lot of different possibilities. I have a follow-up question to what the first kind of, hey, this could be my career. When do you know, and maybe it's still not the case or it's still open for you, when do you think you closed the door on playing as your way to earn a living? Because that's like the chapter opening for me. I thought I was going to play as a living, as grade 9. I was hoping I would. And I got to a place where I was like, I actually don't, that's maybe not the career I want for myself. But I'm curious to hear if you've had that moment and what that was like for you.
I agree that that's the next main question, because I was going to go next to, well, what did you, once you had decided to move down to the Big Smoke and go to CapU,
Right.
What did you foresee yourself doing? What was the plan when you showed up? It sounds like you were not here yet at this next question. You were not yet taking the off ramp, and you were still aspiring to play professionally full time. But when you otherwise, why would you have done it, right? Like I figured that must be the case.
Yeah, I mean, we might as well take the pit stop onto like what got us there. We don't have to jump ahead to the dream dying.
Yeah.
And for the record, it was not a dream dying. It was figuring out another dream. But I think when I moved to Vancouver from Smithers to go to Cap, I probably already by that time understood it was going to be very tough to make any sort of living as a professional musician. I think in the first year, you're told over and over again by professors that like gigging full time is probably not what you're going to do when you finish this, right? Like statistically, that's very unlikely. A very small percentage of graduates, a very small percentage of people who start first year finish that program at Capilano.
I didn't.
Yeah, I think it's like you have like a kind of 50% completion rate of the first 2 years, I think, and then it goes smaller even from then for your second two after people get the diploma. So I think in short order, it was understood like it's nice to strive for that, and in the absence of having anything else, you should just focus on getting really good at your instrument and aim for that. But I think I already understood it would be unlikely that I would make a total living doing that. I hadn't really thought too hard about my post school life really up until like the end of fourth year. I would say, I think I just was interested in playing, interested in being with my friends, getting to like be totally immersed in music with those folks. And so that all felt great. And I just probably wanted to stay in school forever. If I'm being honest, I don't think I thought too hard about how I was going to, pay my rent.
I have to keep throwing it back to you there, because as is well known, I didn't make it that far.
Yeah.
Just tell me a little bit more about what you thought. I mean, you just said like you were in jest. You were like, "Oh, I plan to stay at school forever," because I never was there. Right. I don't really know what that was like. And I will tell you about when I felt like I was taking the off ramp. But just tell me a little bit more about when you were about to graduate. 2016, 17. What was the plan then? Were you still deep in it?
I was. So it's a 4-year program. You do a diploma in the first 2 years, and then your second two, it does become a little more like career focused, or at least like I think many students start kind of focusing on like what are the options. And I think some of my friends had already started teaching music lessons, and I tried that in I think probably the end of my third year and part of my fourth year. Decided that teaching music lessons wasn't really for me. The program at Cap at the time, I'm sure it still does, has a strong like educational branch you could take where you can kind of do a bunch of prerequisites for the UBC teachers program or your education certificate. And I decided I didn't want to do that. I wasn't interested in teaching high school, elementary school. And so I kind of was experimenting with those things. And as those things were falling off the possibility train, I kind of had a little amount of, I guess, worry, or at least acknowledgement that like what I decide to do to pay my bills might not be music. Or at least my understanding was it wouldn't be drumming. And that was because in my third and fourth year, I kind of switched my focus from my primary instrument, which is the drums, to a secondary kind of lesson you're allowed to take. Some people do a second instrument, like piano lessons or something. I studied composition. And so by my kind of third and fourth year, I was really enjoying learning about composing. Wrote some music for my friends, some stuff that you and I have recorded.
And I will interject, you could already play piano. You already had that background.
Yes. Yeah, I could already play piano. And so that certainly helped with composing. It would have been a tall order to not be able to play any piano and go right into composing. And so I think by near the end of my fourth year, I understood I probably wasn't going to be a teacher of any sort, privately or in a school. And I had been focusing so much on the composing and not kept up quite the amount of practicing as a drummer that, like, say we graduated near, like, Bobby Weens, for example, who had graduated maybe a year or two previous, or even Miles, folks who practiced a ton. Bobby Weens famously for 10 hours a day or something on some days.
Kick-ass drummers.
Really, yeah. And so I, more than it wasn't necessarily out of comparison, it was more noticing where the defaults are, right? I think one common piece of advice to young artists or young folks figuring out what they want to do is kind of to tell them to pay attention to what they're doing when they have nothing else to do. And I think a really dedicated instrumentalist will just sit at their instrument and practice because they just like being there. And by, extension of that, they get really, really good at their instrument. I was noticing I was defaulting more to sitting at the computer and composing, or making music in Ableton. And I think I had kind of by the end of fourth year started looking at maybe how would I take this further. So I was interested in master's programs at the time. One of my profs had kind of encouraged me to look into those. But I also knew, having just spent 4 years in school, there was no way I was going to afford to send myself to Toronto or Montreal for a master's program. So I kind of just figured I have to figure out a job and go from there.
Yeah, and I won't let you understate the extent to which you had already flexed your production muscles with your friend David Lavoie. How many beat tapes had you already self-released by this point? 5, 6?
I think by the end of fourth year, it was 8 or 9.
100 tracks of sample stuff and beats that you had made that you had put out to the world.
Yeah, David and I had done that. And I'd been producing in Ableton for even I think 4 or 5 years before I ever went to CAP. It was kind of a hobbyist interest of mine. And in fact, I think my dad was the first person to point out to me that he noticed that when I had nothing else going on, I was not sitting at the drum kit, I was making music in Ableton. And he kind of said this is maybe in my first year at CAP or even just before that. And it had at the time it had annoyed me or offended me a little bit. He said, I think if I was to place a bet, I think you like doing this more than you like drumming. And my identity was very much tied to the drums and to playing. And I was like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. I love drumming, which I do. I love playing with my friends. But I think he was correct that I was always, always going to spend more time at this art form, music production, than I was at practicing and being, a top 1% drummer, which is kind of what you have to focus on if you're interested in the gigging career path or studio musician career path.
Yeah, and we'll talk about what people tell you have to focus on and the notions of the careerism that we've seen out there and how relevant it may or may not be.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that, just like we'll talk about David again if we end up spending time specifically on our albums. But that's a good long bet that he called there on, because at the time you had all that production experience, but you also were playing in like indie rock bands and DIY venues, and you were playing with certain artists, and like on their you recorded albums with them. You started playing with them, like your fellow central northern BC person Cole Patenaude, and artists like that. You were starting to play out there as a drummer in various genres as well. So for him to call that at that point, was quite a prescient time for him to say that.
Yeah, a long call. And you know what? I think he probably saw that, just thinking about his own practice, right? Where like he is a person where when I'm still up north for, Christmas or whatever, if he has nothing going on in an evening, he will drive to the studio and knock out a couple hours painting after having just done a workday of painting. Just because that's what he likes doing. And so I think, I definitely admire that quality in him. And I do have that with production. I at times have done that with drumming too. I don't want to say I don't like drumming. I love drumming. But I think he was noticing my tendency, that I could much more easily sit for hours doing music production. So then to throw it to you, like when you left school, what did you kind of think your prospective paths, either in the arts or otherwise, were you thinking of that? You still played a fair amount right after leaving school, right?
Yeah. So I've stated it many times. I left after 1 year. I turned 19 years old at the beginning of 2014, and I'm a free agent. I've dropped out, and I did that for the purpose of continuing to play full time. Yeah. I left because I knew I didn't want to be a teacher, and I had seen that that's what it was for. And I knew that I could try and do my own thing right now. I was just barely possible that I could do that. And that's all I really cared about, was I just wanted to try and do it my own way at the time. So I took my first opportunity to do that by exiting the program kind of after my first year. And what I did was try to play full time.
Yeah.
And I did so with the North Shore Celtic Ensemble nonprofit organization as kind of an anchor thing that I managed to stick around at and have it evolve into something that was substantial enough for me to treat it that way. And I ended up forming a band as a consequence of being in that community that ended up being my main project as well.
Yeah.
And I got to record that band's first album and tour it, and that band was my main gig. Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to play full time that whole time. So back to the question that we identified as like the next crucial thing, it's like, when did I take the off ramp? It literally was COVID. If it were not for that, I might still be attempting to do that. Who knows 5 years out what degree of success I would have, but it's possible that it would still be my intention if not for COVID, because right up until COVID, I was playing in the band that I co-founded, and we were planning our year of gigs, both local and touring, and side playing projects, whether they were in the folk genre like that band or anything else. Wasn't playing a lot of jazz yet at this time. Again, I hadn't quite come back yet, but was still very, very much, I'm 25 years old when COVID starts. Right up until the day that COVID started, I was still bought in. Yep. And not only was I bought in, but I had formed a circle around me that would enable me to do that. And I'm saying that in a way where it is both good. It is good. Of course it's good. But, it can also lead to a dark side depending on what I do. But like in 2019 into 2020, around me, I had a spouse, I had friends, I had family, all of whom were behind and bought into the idea that I was attempting to pursue this. Yeah. So it wasn't that I was trying to run away from anything anymore or reject anything anymore. I figured that this is what I was going to try and do regardless of how hard it was. Yeah. And I surrounded myself with people who understood that to whatever extent was possible. So I was pot committed. Yeah. And you can be pot committed until you go all in and lose, which is what happened to me when COVID started. So,
Right.
that's a hard checkpoint for me. And then I have to kind of reevaluate it from scratch. Yeah.
So it was the kind of inability to continue playing live. Those income streams stopped, and you had to kind of pivot to kind of reevaluate, like, what else could I do in the absence of any of that?
Yes, because it all disappeared and it did not come back.
Right.
My band did not come back as the main professional pursuit for any of the four of us because we all reevaluated our lives and we ended up doing different things.
Yeah.
I had just entered kind of a new position at the North Shore Celtic Ensemble, who eliminated the position when COVID started because
Right.
their budget went under review as well because they couldn't do anything. The group's main activity was like performing music in large groups in seniors' homes. It's like
Right.
the worst possible thing. So that's gone. I'm not like a local gigging side musician. So even
Yeah.
when stuff, continues to happen locally or comes back online, that's not the world I was in.
Yeah.
I was trying to drive a specific band around the country.
Yeah.
And that didn't come back because we all went different directions. So it was really starting from scratch. And Rhythm Changes was one of the first things that I attempted
Yeah.
just to figure out what I wanted to spend my time doing in that time, in a version that was very small and not directly leading to what it is today. But in the summer of 2020, that seed gets planted
Yep.
for the very first time. And then I walk back through a series of other things that kind of lead me to the current work I do today, which is probably a separate subject that I will give you the opportunity to jump in on instead of just launching directly into that.
I mean, I think I remember a conversation about rhythm changes at a park hang in 2020. That summer when those were allowed, right? You could like see a friend for a day, and then you'd leave it a couple days, and then you'd see another friend in a park somewhere. I remember the inception of it and thinking like that's a very neat idea. And I also remember that year of kind of thinking about like, well, what do any of us do? I myself also went, from playing in, I think, 4 bands at the end of 2019 to 0 bands in 2020. And that certainly was a factor in like where I got to now. Yeah, it's interesting to think about like if those income streams or those kind of possibilities hadn't gone away, where we'd be now. But even to like step back, I guess, a little bit, because you talked about, the band Early Spirit, and that was kind of where you settled on as a focus. Do you think it's kind of a sideways or an indirect kind of extension maybe of the community we came up in, where oftentimes what you would do is sideman full-time, sideman a bunch in like a jazz context. Was that a conscious, you decided to not do that after leaving school? Did you sideman some and decide not to keep involved with it?
Yeah, it's interesting. It is something that is not a big part of my story ever. The only period when it was only slightly was right after I left, for kind of that 1 year when I'm like 19 years old and I'm trying to do that.
Right.
And other than that, yeah, it is something that I didn't pursue to the same extent as, so many of our friends. And it wasn't because I wanted to do what I'm doing now, because I didn't know about this stuff yet at that time.
Yeah.
It was because I wanted to be a band leader, composer. I'd already written a lot of music, and I kind of just wanted to play my music. And like I had enough music that was enough that was scratching the itch for me. And you played my music, and some of these other people who've named before already did, and some other ones. And so that was fine. I wanted to just work on that, and I wasn't trying to go and play as many different side musician gigs as I could. I did pick up a lot of random ones when I was 19, 20 years old just for work, but it was never really like my bread and butter. And now it's not a thing at all. There's like 1 or 2 other projects that I will play in, and that equates to like a handful of gigs a year. So like it's not a major pursuit now. It wasn't back then. And in the leading into and out of COVID, wasn't something that I missed.
Sure.
Nor was it something that I thought I would be reorienting towards. So I feel like I conceded that track quite a while ago.
Yeah.
And I figured, well, I'm gonna be a composer band leader. I'm gonna be a member of this band that I started. I'm gonna play the odd things here and there, as much as I find for my own enjoyment. But the side musician career and the touring performer career, being a higher plane of that existence, wasn't something that called to me, and I don't have the chops or the skills to underwrite that. I never really did. I'm kind of more of a self-taught person. So that's a path. That's another path.
Yeah.
That I suppose I always kind of looked off without really considering it, whether or not I wanted to do it. I just didn't. I didn't go there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Always an entrepreneur, I guess, right? And always, your own band leader and composer, doing your own thing, which is rad. Yeah, I was thinking about it because I think in this city, as a bassist, you probably, if you had decided you really wanted to dig into being a sideman, could have certainly done that for probably years on end. Again, COVID kind of shut a lot of that down, and people had to figure out either other income streams or how to handle being unemployed for years on end. But
yeah. There are two things that I'll add. One is that, and I even kind of I breezed by this little. I'm thinking of my guest spot on the Rhythm Changes podcast, hosted by Chris in his kind of first bucket. I breezed past this a little, and obviously you're not learning anything by me saying this, but for the record, the bedrock of everything I learned about how to perform, it was all those gigs that I did with Madeline Elkins.
Yeah.
I would be absolutely nowhere without that. That was my formative experience that proved to me that I can do it.
Yeah.
Especially because I didn't continue in the program, and you don't have the full 4 or 5 years or career to look back from. That's right down there at the bottom of my formative, the bottom is in the core of my formative musical experiences, and it still continues today. So, and there are other things that were like that too, like being at North Shore Celtic Ensemble and all the different branches that came out of that tree. But that, starting from New Westminster Secondary, that means so much to me. And it still does. And then the other thing is electric bass versus upright bass. I chose to go towards the electric bass because that's what I played in Early Spirit in my band. And I was okay to walk away from the upright bass because I didn't want to do the sideman thing.
Sure, yeah.
And if I did want to do the sideman thing, what would be asked of me in the jazz scene would be to play a lot of upright bass.
Yeah.
And I didn't do it. So that's another factor actually that kept me on a different thing than the sideman thing, was that I ended up just playing electric bass and not really going further with the upright bass. My last big kind of upright thing was for half of my first album I played upright, and then after that I kind of let it go. I don't I still actually played on the first Early Spirit demos before Jay Knutson was in the band and singing, or no, he was in the band, but it wasn't his songs. It was Gabrielle Dubroy's instrumental project on violin. I played upright then, that was the summer of 16. After that I really let it go. Ever since then, I can't play more than 30 minutes of upright bass without my fingers falling off.
Oh man. Yeah, I was going to say you had probably enough trips on the bus with your upright and amp in that first couple of years to decide no more, electric only.
Yeah, so that's a factor as well in terms of the longer that went on, the less I thought about playing a lot of especially jazz gigs. But as a bass player, you get gigs on both, that's for sure. Yeah.
So the sideman thing falls away somewhat. The playing live in Early Spirit or your own project kind of in COVID becomes not viable. So Rhythm Changes gets started. You end up with some other work. How do you think like that crystallized for you, kind of like where you're at now, which seems fairly sustainable as a career path? How did that kind of crystallize?
Oh, I can't wait to hear how you describe how you got to, because this is where it becomes like a series of happenstance, like a series of lucky breaks or good breaks. That's what I'm about to lay out. And
Sure.
I think you've got the same. So,
Yes.
but I'll give you mine. So it's very weird. Like, so I start doing Rhythm Changes from nothing. Some of the first people you meet through doing that are music publicists, people who will pitch you the music that they hope that you will feature and that then they can bring back to their clients, right?
Yeah.
So I start Rhythm Changes to have something to do. It's not making any money. I'm not playing gigs. I'm not making any money.
Yeah.
My spouse still is, and so we're still getting by. But I'm relying on some of my debt facilities to hold up my end of that bargain.
Yep.
And pay the rent and such. And Rhythm Changes is not doing much about that, even though I've gotten used to writing and I've started hosting the podcast and the gig list is even starting and stuff. We're getting into like spring of 2022 when things come back. Around this time, I go on a family vacation with Vez, my spouse, and with my mom to Vancouver Island in the summertime. And I'm like, well, I'm running out of like the track here.
Yeah.
Like I'm about to kind of max out what I have right now, and I need to figure something else out as soon as I get back. But I'm going to enjoy this vacation as much as I can, not worry about it for 2 weeks. And then when I get back, I got to get my shit together.
Right.
And I don't check my, Rhythm Changes accounts or social media or email or anything for those 2 weeks in the summer of 22. And then I come back and there's an email in my Rhythm Changes inbox from one of the publicists who has pitched music to me regularly for a few years. And I've covered a bunch of what he's sent me.
Yeah.
And he says, hey, I'm going to recommend you for a contract position at a record label because they need to find somebody fast. And I find you to be pretty competent based on your work at Rhythm Changes. I'm going to recommend you.
So just based on your interactions, like publicist to editor, he was like,
yeah, I've never met him in person at this point. I met him for the first time after I got this job. Spoiler alert.
Interesting.
So I never met him. He sends me that. What's that?
Oh, I was going to say his read on your competence was purely based on like, hey, review this album and like your communications back to him and your work on Rhythm Changes. That was like, he's kind of taken a leap of faith there, or had you interacted like a fair amount?
No, from my opinion, I didn't have any above and beyond personal interaction with him. It was just random interactions, the course of doing business at Rhythm Changes.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
So that email is in my inbox. There is also an email in my inbox from the founder of this record label saying that he wants to chat with me.
Wow.
Which I have now left unread for like 5 days because I was on vacation. So I got back to him right away. I've never done this before. I've never worked for a music company or a record label as an employee or a freelancer. What I have done that is actually relevant is when I started Early Spirit, what I used to get some cash was I got a job as an office manager / bookkeeper,
right,
full time for about a year. Which I also managed to get without any, I didn't have a degree or any prior experience, mostly through family connection, to be honest. But hey, that's what you do. If you have those, use them.
Yep.
But I did that. So I had a little bit of like financial knowledge or kind of on the job education. I also used some of that in my latter days at North Shore Celtic Ensemble too. So, I could talk about something that I had done in the administrative or financial experience. I had a ton of marketing experience through Early Spirit.
Yeah.
That that I could talk about in terms of a skill that I had and proof that I had used this skill, because we could get people out to our shows and sell our albums and stuff.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I had that experience. And now I get to kind of do this interview with this guy who's a well-known jazz musician, one of the well-known jazz musicians in the world.
Yes.
Who founded this label. And there were apparently other people that they were considering too. So my recommendation didn't seal the deal. And I did have to talk about what I would bring versus these other people. And for some reason, they did end up choosing me. And so this is my first client in terms of doing admin, marketing, and financial stuff for music companies. And it's a US company, which is particularly cool. I still have never been to New York. Despite doing that. So my first trip to New York is going to be a banger. That'll be when that finally happens.
Amazing.
Especially with Corey Weed's connection now as well. Yeah. But that's my first client. And then I have a year where that's my big client. And I'm just messing around doing a couple other things with local people here and there, but no other main clients.
Yep.
And then that ends and I get another main client, which is Corey Weeds and Cellar. And I got to know Corey Weeds as an adult because of the Rhythm Changes podcast.
Right.
His episode was my first real long-form conversation with him as an adult. Before then, I had just been a kid who went to Corey Weeds' Jazz Cellar in Kitsilano. Now I do a little bit of work with Tim Reinert of Infidels Jazz. My first conversation with him ever was his episode of the Rhythm Changes podcast. And, I got to know him by doing that. So some people have asked me about like monetizing Rhythm Changes or whatever. And it's like, well, it's all gravy now. Cause like the real monetization of Rhythm Changes was that it was like my university degree and my certification, all in one, because it got me the opportunity to do this work that I'm doing today without a degree, without any experience that is legible to any major employer.
Yeah.
And I still don't really understand why. But I know that it is the case because it's in my recent memory and I've seen it happen. I don't know how translatable this is to anybody else's life, but I was at the end of my line in the summer of 22, and then boom, it's like I get this return from what this Rhythm Changes hobby, and it leads into all these things. Like now I've been a production coordinator of festivals. I've run royalty accounting for labels that have hundreds of albums. I do marketing for both shows and albums. It's crazy. Like now I'm in this game, and we hadn't talked about this when we were talking about our come ups. I didn't think I was going to be doing all that stuff, beyond like starting my own band. I didn't think I was going to be doing it for other people. So I mean, it's really wild how that all just kind of happened.
It's a real it's a quintessential preparation meets opportunity space, even though the preparation you probably weren't aware was preparation for anything. You were just kind of doing your thing and getting really good at some skills that, it turns out were going to be very useful down the road and net you some cool opportunities, which is awesome.
Yeah. So where do you start your series of lucky breaks and how it translates into roughly what you're doing now, which you could describe as like a certain kind of big tech job, at like a larger US based tech company or something. You had some early jobs when you were in school or around your school time that you might trace to that, but I don't know how you're going to describe your version of what I just said. So where do you want to start?
I guess so. All in the back of my head this whole time through music stuff, understanding that it's a very tough field, that I'm not interested in teaching really. I'm not super interested in being like a sideman or a studio touring musician. And so my prospects as like a professional drummer to pay the bills seem pretty slim. And there isn't really, beyond just like being an independent artist, a path to being a professional Ableton guy. The Ableton thing, though, had come from a teenage interest in technology. And I had a job as a 16, 17-year-old working at a Mac repair shop in Smithers with some friends who are much smarter than me, and one of whom's like a robotics engineer at some enormous company now, taught me how to do computer repair at quite a young age. And so I did that before going to CAP. And while I was at CAP, every professor had a broken MacBook. I did hard drive replacements for like Dave Robbins, Steve Caldestad, some other.
I didn't know this.
You didn't know that I worked on everyone's computer? Yeah, Bradshaw Pack. I was like the in-house sort of secret computer repair guy for all the profs' personal laptops. Yeah, I literally had Steve Caldestad's home iMac open, like because iMacs are all one piece. So you have to like lift up the screen to get at the hard drive. Had that open in front of on his desk one afternoon after school.
So this is your rhythm changes.
This is my rhythm changes, I guess. Yeah. So I worked on that, just kind of like, freelance, and I charged very little. I would just say like make them pay for the parts, and then like $50 for my time or something. When I finished school, I had kind of vague notions of like, maybe I want to go to a master's program. I was playing in bands and I wanted to keep doing that. But I needed to pay rent. And so I got 2 part-time jobs, one at a brewery and one at Apple, Apple retail. I think probably when they hired me, they were not at all interested in my old Mac repair experience. In fact, I've heard since Apple actually prefers to hire people with 0 experience. They would rather kind of teach you from the ground up, because the Apple way of doing, say, repair or whatever is not exactly how you would just do it if you were self-taught. And they can kind of teach you Apple habits. Some people would say good habits. Some people would just say like it's just they wanted a brand, an on-brand way of doing everything, which works very well for them. So they weren't interested in the fact that I'd done computer repair when they hired me. I was a part-time, I think like sales associate, which if you know me, that's a bad idea. I'm like,
sales is not your scene.
No, sales is not exactly my forte.
You were in your early 20s still.
Yeah, I was
early to mid.
Yeah. And Apple is not a super salesy place anyway, but I had a kind of a miserable time doing that. And after about 6 months, I asked if there's any way I could do one of the computer repair jobs at the Genius Bar. And they kind of grumbled a little bit and said, well, that's very unusual. You're kind of like in the most entry-level position in the store. That would be the highest position in the store. But Apple also had all these rules about like there's no direct path to anywhere. So they cannot exclude you on the fact that you're like too quote unquote like low ranking or whatever, too low seniority to become, I hate the term, but the genius in quotes.
You hate it because we still call you that occasionally.
I do, yeah. Yeah. Never gets old.
Can't live it down.
Can't live it down. So I was allowed to interview for that position. And I don't know if like the previous experience, that's why they let me interview, or if something else came up in the interview that they said like, sure, let's do it. Again, it was, I think, a preparation meets opportunity thing where most of the Genius Bar were full-time people who were, more adult than I was, like families and mortgages to pay. And so the part-time job didn't have a ton of applicants. If you were kind of a longer time Apple employee, you probably were already full-time, and I was fine with being part-time because I had another part-time job. So I got the part-time Genius job, and I think within like 3 months, they asked if I was interested in going full-time because another position opened up, and I was. And that was the first time working at Apple certainly wasn't like what I wanted to do forever. But it was the first time where like my needs were being taken care of in terms of like I was able to pay my rent and put some money away to save, could afford to go on a vacation once a year, and still had time to play in bands in the evenings. And that was what kind of crystallized for me that was something I was interested in doing. Earning a living with the tech stuff, which I found really kind of fulfilling, and making music with my friends whenever I chose, not having to depend on that for for income. So I did that for a couple of years and reached a point where I didn't really want to be doing computer service for the general public anymore, and applied at a job at a tech startup. And that startup was a really good place to start in like kind of corporate IT, because I knew nothing and they didn't mind because they couldn't pay me. Like if I knew anything, they wouldn't have been able to afford an IT person who knew anything.
Yep.
So I got hired in end of February 2020. So after 2 weeks of work, we all went to work from home, and I got to learn how to do like corporate IT from home that year. Again, very lucky break. I had nothing else going on. And so the nights where I'd finish work feeling completely clueless about what I was supposed to do, I could just log another, 3 or 4 hours just learning about stuff, reading about things that I didn't understand yet. And really it helped that I had no life besides my job at that point.
It's a great point. Yeah, you weren't playing in a bunch of bands, so you were looking to fill that time anyway, so you could learn and mess around.
Yeah, I was really focused, just in the absence of anything else to do. So that really helped. I really was able to grow quite quickly in that job. So much that when that company got acquired by a much larger firm, I got asked to work for the much larger firm and do IT for like 6 companies. I'm kind of oversimplifying what exactly happened. But I worked for like a mergers and acquisitions firm where I got to do IT for big companies and do a bunch of migrations. And now I work for a much larger company. I left that job almost 2 years ago, and have a work from home, kind of what I would describe as a fairly cushy tech job for an American company, doing kind of back end IT stuff for them. A huge amount of lucky breaks. Along the way, there's been a lot of music, which I guess I can also talk about, but like career wise, that really fell into place for me, I guess, like you, kind of also because of COVID. If it hadn't been that, I would have maybe still been working at the Apple store and playing in a bunch of bands and not still quite sure what I was going to do to get out of that situation.
Yeah, I guess the only difference between our timelines there is that when at the beginning of COVID, I was still pot committed to my original conception of what I thought I was going to be doing. There wasn't a doubt or a question there for me yet until it was handed to me, that way. And you had previously cultivated this separate thing, and you were running them in parallel, and then thus you would still kind of wonder about, where your ambitions were going next. Just thinking about when we were about to reach COVID. Yeah. Those timelines are then in kind of slightly different places. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think I had probably put aside I want to do music full time, by the time I finished school, because I would see the people who had already graduated who were making a go of it. We've got good friends who still are, basically full time. Some teach privately a little bit. But there's a couple people in the scene who really just play a lot. And I think I probably saw how much work that is, how many late nights and how much practice. And I think decided that wasn't for me. Again, as a career, I loved playing with my friends, but, to be out till past midnight every night making okay money, but not always having an easy time making rent in Vancouver, which is, pricey city to live in if you don't have a big bunch of cash to sit on. That would be a tough sell as well, just be gigging full time, hustling for gigs that way.
Yeah, it becomes about getting into projects that tour, and then that's a whole separate lifestyle that neither of us have really expressed a predilection for, right? So that's its own thing. That's also how I feel about our friends who are school teachers. That is also a very demanding job.
Yeah,
that
definitely.
I personally don't have the personality traits to do well at.
Yeah, I think that's one of those where I really admire the people who can do it, and I see them do it, and I think, wow, I don't think I could. Don't think I could do that myself.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where we can zoom out a little bit and think about, well, we've talked about what it looked like from our vantage points, but when we got into some of these different places, like the most obvious one just being when you're in a university music program, there's messages being sent to you about what the career could be, and they're based on who's giving them. Like, they're based on the career experiences of the faculty, which will be 1 or 2 generations removed from you. And so they're going to talk about experiences that are based on when they came up, and some stuff gets some the conditions change, and some of the messaging gets lost pretty quickly because it feels out of date and such. But nevertheless, you will receive messages that will inform this process that we both went through and that everybody goes through about what you think you're going to do or what you think is possible. As we both said, we both showed up already being convinced that it was possible. Yeah. So we didn't need them to tell us that, but they would tell us about what we could expect or what they thought might be possible. And then, you talk to the normies in your life and you have amusing conversations about what they think is possible too. And so it's like, does your idea of what you want to do, how does it stand up to scrutiny from all these different forces? But I think in general, there's an interesting thing about, well, we're still moving down the line, and this is where it plays into the other topics we talk about how the digital forces keep playing on the music industry, and the industry keeps transforming and trying to survive and react to these changes, and old career paths get threatened. And it's like, what can they even tell somebody who shows up today? Who is delivering the message today? Is it somebody who's our generational peer? Is it somebody who has a background like ours trying to tell somebody younger than us about what we thought was possible? Is it still the older people? Does any of that have a hope of surviving the systematic pressures that we're talking about in some of our other subject matter here on this show and in what we're interested to you? What do you think about that whole mess of stuff now that we've talked about our own paths here?
I guess I'm curious, like what messaging you received, even in your first couple of years, school, and then right afterwards, because no matter what you're doing, there will be people in your ear suggesting what you could do or having remarks about the decisions you are currently making. So I'm curious what you were told. I would say when I was at CAP, there's a class you take in 4th year, which I think is just called music business, which is a funny name for that class because it's sort of just about like, it's a grab bag of like learning about things that you could do with your music degree. And I think both of our stories show, I mean, not that you have a degree, but it doesn't matter clearly that you have, whether or not you have a degree, because to predict what you'll do is a complete crapshoot, right? It's about so many other factors, and it's going to be more about your other interests than it is going to be about your playing ability, unless you're in that kind of very small percentage. But that course, I think, it was like a 6 week. So they had one presenter per week of like what you could do. So there was academia, just like you could go on to higher education and see where that takes you. That was presented by Dr. Jared Burrows with a very doom and gloom. Don't plan on ever, he said, don't plan on ever getting a university teaching job. Because I think many people, probably at that time, myself included, thought like, well, it's a long shot, but like one day I'll get a PhD and then people with music PhDs can teach at a university. And he kind of outlined like the grim realities of like how few jobs there are for that in Canada, how many people are applying for those jobs, and how really it's not about your academic prowess at that point. It's about like, have you sold a bunch of albums, and does a music, faculty or a music university like want you on their faculty for like star power more than, like how many papers have you written and how did your PhD go? So that kind of squashed that dream. Academia was one. Being a music teacher, which you've talked about.
So hold on a second though. That's probably a healthy thing. That's probably a good thing that message was delivered to you at that point, because that's probably true.
It is true, I think. I mean, I can't really imagine what I would have done. Again, I think for any of these things, there's many off ramps that are presented to you in any other career paths. Like if I had just gone right into doing my master's, I would have probably ended up doing a similar thing to what I do now, just with a master's degree in music, and maybe several tens of thousands of dollars more in debt than I ended up after my undergrad. But I probably would have been okay on net. But you're right, that was not like a viable. Jared was wise to say, don't plan on becoming a jazz professor. That would be a tough gig to get.
Yeah.
But like we have friends who do all sorts of stuff. Ben Frost went and got his master's and kind of talked about people he met and his things now on the Rhythm Changes podcast. It'll be recently whenever this comes out. So that was not like a complete black hole, but it was good that they didn't paint it as a rosy picture, because I don't think music academia is rosy. I don't really think any academia is rosy at the moment.
So what were the other tracks, like school teaching and maybe something else?
School teaching. The teacher at Point Grey, the kind of band program leader, and same thing. I don't remember his name. Do you happen to know the
Brent Taylor?
Yes, Brent Taylor came and
great guy.
He came and told us all about the program there, and knowing that I think many of that class were going to be music teachers, he also kind of had a lot of warning signs where he said, don't plan on having a program like Point Grey, basically, because he kind of got handed that program. There was funding there. There was a previous teacher who had like stepped down, who built like the foundations of a really great music program. And so there was like parental support. Students were interested. And then he stepped in and got to like really polish it to make it what it is today. Or he said, you can start from scratch and you can, struggle for like 30 years and maybe eventually build something great, but it's going to be an uphill battle because schools are underfunded. It's hard to get students invested if there's not an existing thriving program. So he also said, like, don't think you're going to like have a killer, 3 jazz bands or like a New West secondary level of engagement, right? I think that's
I happen to be in a good program that was built up for a long time to reach that point. Yeah. And Point Grey, it's a public school that he's teaching at, but that's the richest part of one of the richest per capita cities in the country that he's in. Right. So that helps too.
Yeah, exactly. So it was also helpful for him. He kind of gave quite a stark view of like what the average, your average first teaching job out of university would be, instead of like the rosy kind of Point Grey situation. I think we talked about composing. We talked about, I think we had, I'm going to forget all the names of the presenters, someone who came in who kind of earned sync royalties, composed for film, TV, commercials, talked about that. I think that was maybe what stood out to me as like the most interesting on my side. Although again, it was kind of you have to struggle at first, and it's more about who getting connections, writing a lot of music, and then getting one placement. And, sync placement, depending on what you're placed in, pays quite well. But I think through all of that narrow presentation of like what you could do with a music degree is maybe too focused on music. I understand you have to feel like you're justifying your degree to the recipients of it. But I think the real focus should be like, what else do you do, right? Like music is such a tough field, and you're going to do music regardless, right? Like I have a full-time 9-to-5 tech job now, and I still do music. So music wasn't really the worry. What I should have been focusing on, or what I did end up focusing on, was like finding a way to fit music into my life in a really meaningful way and do something that I can do for years on end, which for many musicians is going to be not necessarily just playing a bunch.
Yeah, I mean, I can cut to the chase in terms of my view about it. I mean, first of all, I guess I didn't, no matter what anybody would have told me, I didn't want to listen. The most important thing for me was that I didn't do what anybody else would tell me to do. Was that I could feel like that it was my own thing. Of course, you're never on an island, and I was built up by, my whole community from high school onward. But I wanted to feel like it was my decision and that I absolutely wasn't doing anything that anybody else told me to do.
Yep.
That was very important to me as a young person. So that's kind of a funny aspect of it. But I mean, if I could reverse engineer it and look back on it and be like, well, if I was receptive, what was the what would be the most helpful thing that I could have heard? And I didn't really hear this because, again, like I said, I built this enabling world because I was so committed to this vision through my early 20s, right? If I could like look at that time period and like reverse engineer what would be one of the best things I can think of that I could have heard if I was willing to listen was, the career position of it is irrelevant to what I'm looking for. What I was looking for was the chance to express myself and feel like there was something that I could create from scratch. And, that process was very exciting for me. I didn't need to bundle that into a career story.
Right.
I never really did. I could have done these things that I did without that. I could have made the albums that I made without that. The band I could have done without that. Rhythm changes I did and could have done without that. I didn't need to frame it all around the quest to be doing it for a career. And I didn't really have anybody else trying to attenuate that search for me. I didn't have any, because I had a very enabling community around me saying, you can do it. You can do this career thing. You are doing it. Keep going. That's a lot. I didn't have anybody who was telling me like, you don't have to keep going. You can find, an actual career, for lack of a better word.
Sure.
Which I have no problem describing that I didn't have, because I didn't. I didn't have somebody being like, you can just have an actual career, and then you can still just do the things that you're after here. You don't have to slam them into this career story. And so I kind of think that we don't need to try and like force the career vision onto anybody, even if it's at the end of a degree where it's kind of funny and you're trying to make sure that everybody feels like they have at least something that they can do with it. Like there's a lot of people who have gone and done, who would have their own versions of your series of breaks where you got into your career with all kinds of other different careers after they get out of music school. And there's a lot who have taken the mainline path too of teaching and such. But I don't think, like I almost if I could rewind it and reverse engineer it, I do. That's why I talked about that kind of what I was surrounded with at the beginning. Was you could say I was enabled more than I needed to be, and that I could have jumped out earlier and or stuck with some of the different day jobs that I had for brief times along the way and still done a lot of what I did and stressed out a lot less about everything, because it's just a more realistic way to look at it. And I think, you could say for people who are younger than us coming up, maybe they don't see as many paths of like viable careers. Maybe they aren't showing up and thinking that they can do it as a career like you and I both did. But also maybe that's okay. Maybe that isn't something to worry about, because maybe they don't feel like they need to wrap it in the career story to be able to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I like that framing of wrapping in a career story. I also think it's so easy, especially if you've grown up maybe like going to in an arts community and going to an arts university program. There's this kind of binary of like, this is artwork and this is not artwork, and to like take a path. Like when I decided to work full time at Apple, you could certainly argue that was walking away from some art stuff that I could have been doing. If I had stayed part-time, I could have been playing more, doing more. But at Apple, I met Luke, my collaborator for Tour de France, which is
Right.
some of my favorite music that I've ever worked on, right? And so to say that was, like either the non-artistic path would be inaccurate, because as long as you're doing what you did, which is being kind of fiercely independent, being authentic to yourself, and sometimes being authentic to yourself is like, I got to figure out how to pay rent for the next year, and then I can think about maybe some other things. But even in those moments, you can find some very cool opportunities that enable you to like make some of the best art of your life.
Yeah, I'll throw in one more contemporary example of like how you met Luke and like how I got exposed to something in my current work before we wrap it, which is, when I grew up and my albums reflect this and a lot of music we made reflect this, I was like a straight ahead jazz guy. I was a swinging straight ahead jazz guy.
Yeah.
And I wrote a lot of music that sounded like that. I loved going to the Cellar and Frankie's and the mainstream stuff. I didn't know anything about the kind of avant-garde improvised side.
Yeah.
And then I started working with Tim.
Right.
And I got exposed by osmosis to what he likes, which is that.
Yeah.
Which I had never bothered to take the time to consider.
Yeah.
And now I really like that stuff.
Don't let Corey hear this.
Me.
Don't let Corey hear this.
Yeah.
Redacted
really.
from the record.
I'm incriminating myself here.
Putting your job in jeopardy. We're talking about career, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I gotta watch out. I gotta play that both sides of the great divide there. And the music that I'm making now in my spare time, without the career story, that is focused on me as a band leader, it reflects that. It's been inspired in a new way by like stuff that I've been exposed to by working for one of my clients.
Yeah.
And there's going to be more of that,
of course,
in the years to come. So that's a cool aspect of it too.
I love that.
Yeah. That went some interesting places. That was a good one. Do you want to try and drop a recommendation section here? Do you have something in particular that you wanted to shout out and link to here?
Yeah, I have a quick one. The author, Kyle Chayka, staff writer at The New Yorker, has a newsletter called One Thing that I've been reading and enjoying it. He's got it's just one thing. Sometimes it's about kitchen utensils. Sometimes it's about small plates, restaurants. It's enjoyable. I've been enjoying reading it.
Yeah, we mentioned him because he has a book that showed up. Episode 1, we talked about the Digging the Greats video series. He's interviewed in it. This is that guy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Kyle Chayka.
Was there an edition of it in particular?
I liked the article about small plates. I do not remember what it was called. I think it's called "This Is Not a Small Plates Restaurant." Check it out. It's funny. It's a funny piece.
Yeah, we'll chase that up.
Yeah. What about you? Do you have a one thing recommendation?
Yeah, I do, which is that and this is the first time that we have directed our attention towards a sport. I don't know how much we're going to do this in the future, but the 2025 Formula One season just started. I'm kind of a boring Formula One fan, Vez and I both, in the sense that, yes, the Netflix show was a major part of our on-ramping, but we've been at it for just long enough now that we can now do the cool thing, which is to talk about how inaccurate the Netflix show is and how over-dramatized it is versus the real happenings on the grid. But as we're talking here, the first Grand Prix race of the 2025 F1 season happened. It was a total mess. There's a lot of F1 YouTubers that have interesting stories to tell about it. I have for so long been inspired by so many different kinds of sports content in terms of, how I conceive of storytelling. There's so many great examples that I could dive back into the people who've inspired me. the first one I would just throw out there is the work of John Boyce at a Secret Base. The YouTube channel is so inspirational, informative to me. I've watched like every video he's made. But yeah, no, my content plug is just the 2025 F1 season and the coming races and stories that will happen this year. It's gonna be interesting.
Awesome. I will have to check that out. Many of my friends are F1 heads, and I've never taken the leap.
There you go. And it's spring, so it's going to be baseball time soon too. So
yes, looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'll be good. All right, man. This has been episode 3. Are we both heading off to the same place here? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to join you.
Yes, we are. We are going to hear some music played by some of our mutuals in about 60 minutes here. So I will see you there.
Cool. See you there. Can't wait.